when I lecture at the American Film Institute or the Canadian Film Center or, universities or wherever, they always, well, how should we start? And I go, start how we did, horror movies. They're cheap, and as long as you've got a new angle, something different, you can do it, and people will trust you.
Look, this is really weird. Are you sure you know what you're... I think I cut myself or something. Get a knife or something in there with...
The Canadian film industry in the early 70s was very rudimentary. It existed, frankly, only in Quebec, in Montreal, and it was pretty much French language films, outside of a couple of filmmakers like Paul Almond, who I worked as an unpaid gopher for, and a company called Cinepix that I eventually ran their production for. Prior to that, while I was in film school, one of our professors, Marc Gervais, who was very well connected with people, would loan us out as free labor to various people. And one day he came in and he said, does anybody want to go to Vancouver? A friend of mine's producing a movie out of there, and he needs some help, and it'd be a good experience, but there's no money and no money to pay to get you out there. So I knew of this company called Drive Away that they would pay you to drive cars west, and then you'd have to get yourself back. So I figured, well, I could do this. And I went out, and the film was McCabe and Mrs. Miller. And I ended up working as a free gopher. And then one day I had to drive Julie Christie into town from the location, and she enjoyed me, and she started requesting me to drive her everywhere. So for that, I guess it was about 4 weeks I was out there. I was Julie Christie's driver. The creation of the CFDC under Michael Spencer was pivotal for getting the Canadian film industry jump-started, I suppose. There was very, very little private funding in the Canadian industry outside of companies like Cinepix and what have you. So when the CFDC came in, they enabled a lot of filmmakers to cobble together the various financing sources around and make their films. There wasn't a ton of money, but there was enough to basically get things going. There was Cinepix Inc., which was basically a distribution company, and they had produced a couple of very well-received French skin flicks called like Valerie and L'Initiation. And when I joined them, it was basically John Dunning and Andre Link were the two partners, and they had a number of people that worked for them in the distribution side and in the promotional and a couple of floors, but the rest of it was being finished. And that's where we primarily shot everything, and on those grounds. And I remember the swimming pool was finished as well, so that's where we pretty much shot it. And the budget for Shivers, as I remember, was, I think, $105,000. It was the very first exploitation film that the CFDC invested in, and it created a huge amount of trouble for Michael Spencer and the CFDC because the critics and the parliamentarians were appalled that they were putting public money into the horror movies. So at Cinepix, we actually ran a campaign pushing back against this, arguing that there was a place in Canadian cinema for everything, including horror films. And it was amazing the amount of heat we and Michael Spencer took for investing in David Cronenberg's first movie. And I always find it amusing that David is now a cultural icon and the critics love him and everything else. And, people thought he should be committed. And then Ivan and I, who are both not Canadian citizens, but, immigrants, they wanted to deport us for, doing horrible things like that. So it was pretty funny. And it took years before the CFTC would invest in another horror movie. David had actually...
Look, I don't hit nobody with glasses.
Rabid was the biggest production Cinepix had ever done to that time. It was $500,000. I was shot in Montreal, all over Montreal, but we didn't have one central location like we did on Shivers, which made it more expensive and trickier to shoot. But it was all shot in Montreal. Casting Marilyn Chambers is what is known these days as stunt casting. You know, how do you punch above your weight? We couldn't afford a big star, but we could afford Marilyn, and she had the industry knowledge. She had been in Behind the Green Door and this film and that film, so it was like we were buying ourselves a well-known name for not a star price. So that was the whole idea, and that was Ivan's idea. I don't remember what we paid her, but we got her for whatever, we could afford it. There weren't any concerns from Cinepix because Cinepix was distributing Skinflix. That was their bread and butter business, so they were aware. I mean, it wasn't hardcore, but it was, well known. I think they had distributed Behind the Green Door in a soft porn version in Canada. So she was known. We didn't really have any issues one way or the other that we thought with her. She showed up with her manager, who was this very weird guy. I think he was actually her boyfriend as well. And he was more trouble than Marilyn. I mean, the funny thing with Marilyn was she kept expecting us to have her take her clothes off, and we were like, no, you don't have to do that. I think we had one scene where she takes her top off.
Oh, no, don't go. I'm all right, really. But I'm freezing cold. Oh, you're so warm.
Look, I better...
Hold me.
The most challenging aspect of Rabid's production, like most Canadian films, was that we could never get the money until it was near the end of the year. That's the way these things worked. And so we were shooting a movie that had scenes where people were going into the water and on the streets, half-dressed and all of that, in November. And it was cold. It was really, really cold. And that was a real challenge, just keeping everything going and keeping the actors warm and just getting everything done. So that was one of the major challenges. David was more sure of himself, sure of what he wanted to do on Rabid. And I think he was also starting to chafe under the bit of both Ivan and I, basically calling the shots. I remember, I fired his first AD, I think, after the first week, and we couldn't get a replacement, so I stepped in. And I took the floor as an AD, and he would, okay, I think my next shot is over. No, sorry, I cut that. We're over here now, So that was the last movie he did with us. So I'm pretty sure he wanted to get out on a bit more on his own and have a bit of a leash released and all that. So it was good. The one thing I do remember on Rabid is that I had a strict edict that we could not have any locations anywhere near either a stereo store or a motorcycle shop, because I would lose David for hours on the way to set.
Lloyd! Lloyd! My God, I just saw a motorcycle explode in that field.
I liked the final film. It was well received. We sold it to U.S. distribution, and I remember going down to the 42nd Street Grindhouses in New York and standing in the back of the theater and listening to the audiences go crazy for it. I think the critics found it more interesting and less, the whole sexual innuendo of Shivers. It was somewhat less than that. It had its own things with the thing under the arm and all of that. It was still pretty creepy, but for some reason it seemed to resonate more, and I think was more critically accepted. Not that it was critically acclaimed, because I don't think it was, but it was a better film. We had more money. We took more time.
I'm afraid.
always refer to Cinepix as being my real film school. Because when I came out of film school, I really did not know what I was doing. And John Dunning was my mentor on the creative side of producing, and Andre Link was my mentor on the financing and nuts and bolts side of producing. And I still credit them to this day with most of my success. Look, you know, without Cinepix, there wouldn't have been a David Cronenberg. And without Cinepix, there may not have been an Ivan Reitman, or certainly wouldn't have been an Ivan Reitman sooner. And as for when I left, I was on my way out of my own volition pretty much when we were starting Meatballs. And I wasn't even 100% there when we were doing Meatballs. I came up to the set several times, but I was moving, realizing that I had to paint on a bigger canvas. Same situation in that they weren't immediately successful, but over the years have attracted this cult following. So aside from Shivers and Meatballs, I mean, I can think of other ones that had the same effect. I mean, the Boondock Saints. We had no theatrical release, and you know, we didn't make the sequel for 9 years. A number of my films have gone on to have this kind of culty thing, and I guess it's part of, you know, my sensibility. So, you know, it's what I like.